a lonely old man, a helpless puppy, and a cruel act of revenge that would test the limits of love and forgiveness. On a freezing winter morning, Jack Thornton woke up to a chilling discovery. His beloved puppy Bailey was gone. The back gate was open, footprints in the snow led into the unknown. But when he learned where Bailey had been taken, his heart stopped. A frozen swamp, a deadly trap, and a man from his past who wanted him to suffer. Would Jack reach Bailey in time? And what drove someone to such cruelty? And stay with us, because what happens next will leave you speechless. The winter air was bitterly cold, carrying with it the sharp scent of pine and the distant hush of snowfall. In a small, nearly forgotten town somewhere in North America, Jack Thornton sat alone in his modest home, listening to the crackling of the fireplace. The old house, worn by time and solitude, creaked softly as the wind howled outside. Jack was 70, though time had made him feel much older. His face, lined with deep wrinkles, bore the weight of years spent in service as a police officer. His once broad shoulders had begun to slump, not just from age, but from the heaviness of loneliness. His wife, Margaret, had passed away 5 years ago, leaving behind only the silence that now filled his days. He had no children, no family nearby, just the quiet town that had grown indifferent to his existence. Dressed in a thick wool sweater and an old pair of jeans, Jack wrapped his calloused hands around a steaming cup of black coffee. The television was off, the radio silent. He had long since grown used to the sound of his own thoughts. That night, the snowstorm had settled heavily over the town, blanketing the streets in white. Jack rarely left his house unless necessary, but something gnawed at him, a restlessness that he couldn't shake. Pulling on his heavy coat, he stepped outside. The cold bit at his skin, seeping through the fabric. The town was deserted, as it always was at this hour. The dim streetlights flickered against the snowfall, casting a soft, eerie glow. Jack made his way toward the gas station at the edge of town. It was an old, run-down place, operated by a man named Bill Carter, who had owned it for nearly 3 decades. Bill was in his 60s, stocky, with a gruff voice and thick grey beard. He was a man of few words, never prying into others' business, but always ready with a knowing nod. Jack expected the gas station to be empty, but as he turned the corner, a faint whimpering sound reached his ears. He paused, frowning. It was coming from beside the station, near the garbage bins. Curiosity and instinct kicked in. He followed the sound and found a small cardboard box, half buried in the snow. The whimpering grew louder as he crouched down. His heart clenched as he peeled back the damp, crumpled flaps. Inside, curled up in a tight, trembling ball, was a tiny golden retriever puppy. The little thing was barely a few weeks old, its golden fur matted with ice and dirt. Its eyes, round and dark, looked up at Jack with an innocence that struck him deep in his chest. It was cold. Far too cold to survive the night out here. Jack hesitated, his old habits of caution telling him to walk away. But the thought of leaving something so helpless in this freezing night was unbearable. Sighing, he reached in, gently lifting the puppy into his arms. It was small, barely the size of his forearm, and it burrowed into his coat for warmth. "Who the hell would leave you out here?" he muttered, anger rising in his voice. He turned back toward the gas station, pushing the door open. The warm air inside was a stark contrast to the bitter cold. Bill looked up from behind the counter, his brows raising at the sight of Jack holding the tiny creature. "You get yourself a dog, Thornton?" Bill asked, setting down his newspaper. "Someone dumped him out there." Jack's voice was tight. "Just left him in a damn box." Bill scratched his beard, stepping closer. He wasn't a man easily moved by sentiment, but even he frowned at the sight of the shivering pup. "Some people got no heart," he muttered. "You gonna keep him?" Jack looked down at the puppy, who had nestled against his chest, his breathing slow and steady. It was warm here, safe. Jack exhaled, his breath shaking slightly. "Guess I don't have a choice." Bill gave a rare smile, nodding. "Good. You could use the company." Jack didn't reply, but for the first time in years he felt something stir within him, something he thought had long since disappeared. The first few nights were difficult. The puppy, whom Jack eventually named Bailey, cried through the cold hours, missing whatever warmth it had once known. Jack, despite his gruff nature, found himself sitting beside its small bed, murmuring soft words he hadn't spoken aloud in years. Bailey was a fighter, though. In just a few days, his strength returned. His tiny paws stumbled clumsily across the wooden floors, his tail wagging whenever Jack came into view. The old man, who had spent the past 5 years drowning in silence, suddenly found his house filled with the pitter-patter of small feet, the occasional crash of an overturned shoe, and the soft, warm weight of a puppy curling up beside him. Jack wasn't a man of outward affection, but he found himself absent-mindedly scratching behind Bailey's ears, talking to him about things he'd never told another soul. Bailey listened, as dogs always do, with complete devotion. The townspeople began to notice the change in Jack. Sarah Whitmore, the owner of the local grocery store, was the first to comment. Sarah was a woman in her late 50s, tall and lean, with sharp blue eyes that missed nothing. She had spent her life running the small store, filling the role of both cashier and unofficial town therapist. After her husband died young, she had learned to harden herself against loss, but there was kindness beneath her tough exterior, kindness that Jack had known for years. When Jack walked into the store with Bailey at his heels, Sarah smirked. "Well, well, never thought I'd see the day," she said, arms crossed. Jack frowned. "What day?" "The day Jack Thornton found something to care about again." Jack scoffed, reaching for a loaf of bread. "Don't read too much into it." But Sarah had already bent down, scratching Bailey's head. "That little guy's good for you," she said, her voice softer. "Don't fight it, Jack." Jack didn't reply, but that night, when Bailey curled up beside him on the couch, he found himself whispering, "Maybe she's right." 1 month passed, and Bailey had fully settled into his new life. Jack's routine had changed. Mornings were no longer spent in silence, but instead began with a puppy excitedly bouncing at his feet. For the first time in years, he felt content. But he didn't know that this happiness was temporary, that the loneliness he had fought so hard to escape would come rushing back in the cruelest way possible. Bailey was not meant to stay safe, and he was meant to be taken, and Jack was about to learn just how much more he had left to lose. The morning was brutally cold, even for winter, the kind of cold that seeped into bones, making every movement sluggish and stiff. Snow had fallen heavily throughout the night, covering the town in a thick, undisturbed blanket of white. Jack Thornton stirred awake before dawn, as he always did, his old habits ingrained from years of patrolling dark streets as a police officer. He stretched, his joints protesting, then slowly made his way to the kitchen, expecting the familiar sound of paws tapping against the wooden floor, the enthusiastic morning greeting of Bailey. But the house was silent, too silent. Jack frowned, setting down his coffee mug as unease began to settle in his chest. Bailey was always up before him, tail wagging, eyes bright, eager for breakfast. But this morning, the little pup was nowhere in sight. He called out, his voice raspy from sleep, but there was no answering bark. His gaze drifted toward the back door. A chill ran down his spine. The door was slightly ajar, the lock broken. Jack's stomach dropped. He moved quickly, stepping outside onto the porch, his boots crunching against the fresh snow. His breath came out in visible puffs as he scanned the yard. His heart pounded as his eyes locked onto something that made his blood run cold. Small paw prints leading away from the house, accompanied by heavier footprints, unmistakably human. The tracks trailed toward the back gate, which now swung slightly open in the wind. He stepped forward, his pulse hammering as he followed the prints to the alley behind his house. There, tire tracks had cut through the snow, deep and fresh. Someone had taken Bailey. His first instinct was to run, to chase after whatever bastard had done this, but logic caught up with him just as fast. He needed help. With shaking hands, he pulled out his phone and called the only man he could trust in a situation like this, Mike Harris. Mike had been Jack's partner once, back when they both walked the beat as young officers, before life had taken them on different paths. Now, Mike was the town's sheriff, a man built like a bear, tall and broad-shouldered, his once black hair now a solid grey. He carried himself with the quiet authority of someone who had spent decades keeping the peace in a town where nothing ever really happened. Until now. Unlike Jack, who had withdrawn from the world after losing his wife, Mike had remained firmly connected to the community. He was a man of patience, known for his deep, steady voice and the way he could diffuse a situation before it ever turned violent. But beneath that calm exterior was a man who had seen more than his fair share of darkness. When Mike answered, his voice was groggy but immediately alert. "Jack, what's wrong?" Jack's grip tightened around his phone. "Bailey's gone. Someone broke in. Took him." There was a brief silence. Then Mike cursed under his breath. "I'm on my way." Jack paced the porch while he waited, his breath short with frustration and fear. The old cop in him wanted to be logical, to stay calm, to think. But the part of him that had grown to love that little dog, the part that had felt something rekindle inside him after years of numbness, was panicking. By the time Mike arrived in his sheriff's vehicle, the sun was beginning to rise, painting the snow in muted shades of gold and blue. He stepped out, bundled in his thick sheriff's coat, his badge pinned to his chest, and immediately assessed the scene. "Show me," he said simply, and Jack led him to the tracks. Mike crouched down, brushing gloved fingers over the prints. "Two people," he muttered. "One carried the dog. Look here, the paw prints stop after a few feet." He pointed at the tire tracks. They had a vehicle waiting. He straightened, pulling out a notepad from his coat. "Did you hear anything?" Jack shook his head. "I was asleep." Mike glanced at him, understanding but grim. "Let's check your cameras." Jack had installed security cameras years ago, a habit left over from his time as a cop. Together they went inside, the warmth of the house doing nothing to thaw the icy tension hanging between them. Jack pulled up the footage on his old laptop, fast-forwarding through the night's stillness until movement caught their eyes. There. At 2:43 a.m., a dark figure slipped through the back gate. The grainy footage wasn't clear enough to make out details, but they could see a man, broad-shouldered, moving quickly, followed by another figure, thinner, younger. They disappeared around the side of the house, and moments later reappeared carrying Bailey. The little dog struggled in their grasp, but they shoved him into the back seat of a truck before driving off. Jack clenched his fists, his body rigid with fury. "That truck, can you track it?" Mike exhaled sharply. "Not from this angle, but I'll send the footage to the station, see if we can enhance it. In the meantime—" He hesitated, as if weighing whether to tell Jack something. "What?" Jack demanded. Mike sighed. "I just got a call before coming here. A hunter near Frostwood Swamp saw something strange this morning. Said he found a small dog wandering near the frozen marsh. Looked scared out of its mind." Jack's heart stopped. "Bailey?" Mike lifted a hand. "We don't know for sure, but it's not a common place for a dog to be wandering alone. If it is Bailey, Jack, that swamp is dangerous. If they dumped him there, he won't last long." Jack didn't wait to hear the rest. He grabbed his coat and was halfway out the door before Mike caught his arm. "Jack," Mike said, his voice firm, "I know what this means to you, but we do this smart. You can't just go running in there alone." Jack wrenched free, his eyes burning. "Then come with me." Mike held his gaze for a long moment, then gave a single nod. They both knew the odds weren't in their favor, that by the time they reached Frostwood, it might already be too late. But Jack wouldn't let himself think that way. Bailey had saved him, given him purpose again, and he wasn't about to let the only thing keeping him tethered to life slip away into the cold. The morning light filtered weakly through the heavy winter clouds as Jack Thornton sat in Sheriff Mike Harris's office, staring at the grainy footage on the screen. His fists were clenched, his breathing slow but tense, a storm brewing beneath his otherwise composed exterior. The truck on the security camera was old, its dark color blending into the night, but Jack didn't need a clearer image to recognize it. The rusted fender, the missing rear bumper, there was no mistaking it. He had seen that truck before. He had put the man who drove it behind bars. Frank Dawson. Jack leaned back, exhaling sharply. His face, weathered by years of service and personal loss, was tight with controlled anger. He hadn't said the name aloud in years, but now it surfaced like a long, buried wound torn open again. He turned to Mike, who stood beside him with arms crossed, his expression unreadable. "It's him," Jack said finally. Mike nodded grimly. "I thought the same thing." Frank Dawson had once been a different man. Years ago, he had been a well-known figure in town, working as a wildlife trapper. He had a thick build, standing a little over 6 feet, with a hard face that was prematurely aged by a life spent outdoors. His brown hair had always been kept short, though the years in prison had streaked it with grey. There was a time when he had been seen as a simple, hard-working man, until Jack had exposed what he really was. Jack still remembered the day they arrested him. Frank had been running an illegal animal trade, trapping and selling wild animals to private collectors, some for sport, some for exotic pets. But all of them suffered. The day they raided his operation, they found cages filled with starving bobcats, wolves, and even a bear cub, trapped in a state of misery. Jack had been the one to slap the cuffs on him. He could still hear Frank's voice, low and shaking with rage, as he was shoved into the back of the police car. Frank was sentenced to 5 years in prison. When he got out, the world he once knew had turned its back on him. His business was gone, his reputation in shambles. His wife, unable to bear the shame, had left him. His son, barely a teenager then, moved to another state with his mother. With no job, no family, and nowhere to go, Frank became a ghost in his own town. And he blamed Jack for it all. Jack clenched his jaw. He never let it go. Mike sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. No, he didn't. He pulled up another file, this one showing Frank's most recent address. After he got out, he barely stayed in town. Lives in a broken-down trailer outside the old sawmill, barely making ends meet with odd jobs. No real employment, no friends. If he took Bailey, he planned it. Jack's fingers curled into fists. He wouldn't sell him. That's not what this is about. Mike didn't argue. They both knew what this was. This wasn't about money. It wasn't about a stolen pet. It was revenge. Jack could already see the twisted logic in Frank's mind. If he couldn't destroy Jack physically, he would make him suffer in the cruelest way possible by taking away the only thing that had brought him joy since Margaret died. But it wasn't just about taking Bailey. No, Frank wanted him to die. He wanted Jack to wake up every morning knowing that the helpless puppy he loved had been left to perish in the freezing swamps, that he had been powerless to stop it. A punishment worse than death. Jack stood abruptly. I'm going to him. Mike caught his arm. Jack, no. Jack cut him off, his voice low and firm. I'm not sitting here waiting. Not when I know who did this. Mike studied him, his jaw tightening, but he didn't argue. Instead, he grabbed his keys. I'm coming with you. The drive to Frank's trailer was short, but the tension stretched long between them. The sawmill had been abandoned for years, a rusting skeleton of the past. Frank's trailer sat at the edge of the property, barely standing, the tin roof patched with whatever scrap metal he could find. A battered generator hummed weakly beside it, struggling to keep up against the winter chill. Jack stepped out of the car first, his breath fogging in the icy air, his hands clenched and unclenched at his sides. Mike walked beside him, his posture rigid, one hand resting near his holstered gun, not because he expected violence, but because he had learned never to underestimate desperation. Jack didn't knock. He kicked the door open. Inside, the place reeked of alcohol and stale cigarette smoke. Empty beer cans littered the floor, and the couch, covered in old blankets, sagged from years of use. Frank sat at the small kitchen table. a cigarette burning between his fingers, his eyes dull but alert. He was thinner than Jack remembered, his once strong frame worn down by time and self-destruction. But his gaze was just as sharp, just as filled with hate. "Well," Frank said, exhaling smoke, his lips curling into a smirk, "look who finally came to visit." Jack's hands slammed onto the table. "Where is he?" Frank didn't flinch. He leaned back in his chair, tapping the ash from his cigarette. "Who?" Jack's patience snapped. He grabbed Frank by the collar, yanking him forward. "Bailey, where is he?" Frank chuckled, the sound low and humorless. "Funny. You think I'd just tell you?" Mike placed a firm hand on Jack's shoulder, a silent warning. Jack took a deep breath, forcing himself to let go. Mike stepped in. "Frank, listen to me. We know it was you. We have you on camera." Frank shrugged, unbothered. "So what? You think anyone in this town gives a damn about some mutt?" Jack's vision darkened at the edges. He wanted to hit him, hard. But Frank wanted that. He wanted to see Jack lose control, to lash out, to be just as broken as he was. Mike's voice remained calm. "You don't have to do this, Frank. You've lost enough already." Frank's smirk faded. For a brief second, something flickered in his expression, something raw, something that might have once been regret. But then, just as quickly, it was gone. He exhaled smoke, shaking his head. "No," he said simply. "Thornton's the one who took everything from me. I'm just returning the favor." Jack's stomach clenched. Frank leaned in slightly, his smile returning, but this time it was colder. "I didn't sell the dog," he admitted. "Didn't keep him either." Jack's breath caught. "I dropped him off," Frank continued, his voice light, casual, as if discussing the weather. "Out in Frostwood Swamp. You know, the part where the ice is thin, where the ground swallows whatever steps on it." He stubbed out his cigarette. "By now, either he's frozen stiff or he's drowned. Either way, you lose." Jack didn't remember moving. He only knew his fist connected with Frank's jaw, sending the man sprawling to the floor. He heard Mike shout his name, felt the burn in his knuckles, but none of it mattered. Bailey was out there, alone, dying. Jack turned away from the crumpled man on the ground, his only thought now on the desperate race ahead. He had to find him before it was too late. The wind ripped through the towering trees of Frostwood Swamp, sending flurries of snow spiraling into the darkness. The storm had worsened since they arrived, the sky thick with swirling ice, making it nearly impossible to see more than a few feet ahead. Jack Thornton moved forward with blind determination, each step crunching against the frozen earth beneath him. Beside him, Sheriff Mike Harris kept pace, his flashlight cutting through the whiteout conditions. Behind them, the rest of the search and rescue team fought against the storm, their voices lost in the howling wind. Jack's body was running on pure adrenaline. His muscles ached, his breath came in short, ragged bursts, but he didn't care. Bailey was out here somewhere, alone, cold, scared. The thought of the little pup, lost in this frozen wasteland, kept him moving forward even when every part of him screamed to stop. Their boots crunched through the ice-laced mud, the thick scent of damp earth mixing with the sharp bite of the cold. Jack kept his eyes locked on the ground, searching for any sign that Bailey had passed through here. The snow had already started covering any tracks, but then— "Jack, over here!" Mike's voice cut through the storm, sharp and urgent. Jack rushed to where Mike was kneeling, small paw prints, half buried by the falling snow, but clear enough to follow. The prints were erratic, weaving in and out of the thick brush, as if Bailey had been running in confusion, trying to find his way. "He's close," Jack said, barely containing the mix of fear and hope in his voice. Mike nodded. "But these tracks, they're leading toward the open ice." Jack's heart dropped. He lifted his gaze toward the dark stretch ahead, a frozen section of the swamp, where the ice-covered water was treacherous. It wasn't solid like the town's lake, reinforced by deep cold. Here the ice was thin, fragile, a deceptive mirror that hid the deadly currents below. They moved faster now, careful but relentless, following the tracks as the storm whipped harder against them. The blizzard blurred their vision, but Jack barely noticed the way his fingers burned with cold, the way his breath turned to ice in the air. His mind was on Bailey. Minutes passed, then an hour. The search stretched into exhaustion. The wind bit at Jack's exposed skin, the temperature dropping dangerously. He knew they were running out of time. If Bailey was still alive, the cold would soon steal the strength from his small body. Mike called into the radio. "Toby, Elena, any sign on your end?" Static. Then Toby's voice, rough with exertion. "Negative. No tracks on our side. We're circling back toward you." Jack clenched his jaw. "He's here. I know he's here." Then, just as despair threatened to creep in, a sound, faint, a whimper. Jack's head snapped up. His blood ran cold. Not far ahead, barely visible through the snowfall, a small golden shape struggled against the ice. Jack's breath caught in his throat. "Bailey!" He surged forward, ignoring Mike's shouted warning. The moment he broke through the tree line, the full picture came into view, and his heart nearly stopped. Bailey was trapped. The little pup clung desperately to a fragile patch of ice, his two front paws gripping the surface while his back legs dangled in the freezing water below. The ice around him was thin, cracked, barely holding together. Every time Bailey tried to pull himself up, the surface splintered further, sinking lower into the frigid depths. Jack's breath caught. His mind screamed at him to move, to do something, but his body refused to process the sight before him. Bailey was slipping. Jack took a step forward, his boots sinking into the snow. His heart pounded in his ears, his voice barely coming out above a whisper. "Hold on, buddy." Bailey let out a weak, broken whimper. His strength was fading. Jack's hands clenched. He had found him, but was he already too late? Jack's breath came in short, harsh bursts as he edged closer to the ice, where Bailey clung for his life. His every movement was calculated, his weight spread low to avoid cracking the fragile surface beneath him. The storm had not let up, and the wind howled through the skeletal trees surrounding the frozen swamp, snowflakes lashing against his weathered face. His entire focus was locked on the small, golden figure struggling just feet away. Bailey's whimpers had weakened, his tiny paws slipping against the slick, breaking ice. Jack's stomach clenched. He was running out of time. Then, from the shadows beyond the tree line, a voice rang out, cutting through the storm like a blade. "Can you save him, Jack?" Jack froze. His muscles tensed instinctively as he recognized the voice. Frank Dawson. Slowly, Jack turned his head toward the sound. Frank stood at the edge of the swamp, arms crossed, a cruel smirk curling at his lips. He was wrapped in a heavy, patched-up coat, a black beanie pulled low over his forehead, but the cold did not seem to bother him. His eyes, dark and hollow, gleamed with something far worse than anger, satisfaction. Jack's grip on reality steadied as white-hot fury surged through him. He should have known. Frank had been here the whole time, watching, waiting for this very moment. "I know what you're feeling, Jack," Frank continued, his voice eerily calm, despite the storm raging around them. "That helplessness, that gut-wrenching fear that you might lose the one thing you love most." He took a slow step forward, boots crunching against the snow. "I felt it when you put me away, when I lost everything, my business, my family, my son." His lip curled in disgust. "You think I was a monster? You took my life away, Jack. You didn't just put me in a cell. You threw me into a pit and left me to rot." Jack's jaw clenched. His fingers curled into fists, but he forced himself to stay focused. Bailey was slipping. He couldn't waste time on Frank's hatred, not now. "Shut up," Jack growled, taking another careful step toward the ice. It cracked, a deep, ominous sound that sent fear shooting through his veins. He stilled, breath coming fast. But Frank wasn't done. He tilted his head, studying Jack with twisted amusement. "You should have let me be, old man. You should have left me alone. But no, you had to be the righteous cop, had to take everything from me." His voice dropped lower, almost a whisper, but the venom in it was unmistakable. "So now I'm taking everything from you." Jack didn't answer. He couldn't. Bailey was slipping again, his small body trembling violently, his strength nearly gone. Jack reached out, his fingers barely an inch away, his heart pounding like a war drum. Then the ice groaned and split beneath him. Jack's breath hitched as he felt the sudden shift beneath his knees. A long, jagged crack ran outward, creeping toward Bailey's fragile patch of ice. His pulse thundered. One wrong move, and both of them would go under. For the first time, Frank's expression faltered. His smirk faded, replaced with something almost uncertain. Jack saw it, the hesitation. And in that moment, something in Frank shifted. Jack didn't beg. He didn't plead for his help. He didn't need to. Because Frank wasn't truly a killer. He had wanted Jack to suffer, to feel the same helplessness that he had felt all those years ago. But he hadn't really thought it would come to this, to watching a man he had once known drown in a frozen swamp. Jack saw it flicker across Frank's face. Doubt. A gust of wind howled through the trees, cutting between them like a phantom whisper. Frank could let Jack die, let Bailey die, walk away and know that revenge had been served cold, just as he wanted. But he didn't. Frank cursed loud and sharp before lunging forward. "Hold on, damn it!" Jack barely had time to react as Frank grabbed a fallen branch and threw himself towards the ice, pressing his weight onto the firmer ground behind him. Jack's grip on Bailey was slipping, the pup's tiny body shaking violently. "Thornton, grab the damn stick!" Frank barked. Jack didn't hesitate. He reached, ignoring the searing pain in his frozen fingers, and grabbed hold. Frank yanked with all his strength, dragging Jack backward, inch by agonizing inch. Crack! The ice behind them gave way completely, a gaping hole swallowing the spot where Jack had just been. The dark water churned violently, but Jack and Bailey were safe. Jack scrambled to his feet, clutching Bailey against his chest. The pup barely moved, his fur soaked, his breath shallow, but he was alive. Jack turned back to Frank, still breathing hard. Their gazes met, not as enemies, not as old rivals, but as two men who had both suffered, both lost more than they could bear. And for the first time, Frank looked tired. The rage, the bitterness, it was still there, but it wasn't all-consuming anymore. Jack didn't thank him. Frank didn't expect it. Instead, they stood there, silent, as the distant sound of sirens broke through the storm. Mike was coming. The rescue team was coming. Frank exhaled sharply, rubbing a hand over his face before stepping back, his expression unreadable. Then he turned, walking away into the woods. He didn't run, didn't hide, he just left. Jack didn't call after him. He had a feeling they'd meet again soon. For now, Bailey needed him. Jack felt the world tilt beneath him. His knees buckled, his boots slipping on the unstable ice as his body lurched forward. Bailey, limp in his arms, barely breathing. The weight of the little pup made his balance even more precarious, and he realized, if he fell now, there was no coming back. The freezing water beneath the ice churned like a hungry beast, waiting for him to make the wrong move. His arms burned from the effort of holding Bailey, his soaked clothes pulling him downward. His breath came in sharp, panicked gasps as he desperately tried to steady himself. But gravity won. Jack's body tilted further, his center of mass shifting dangerously forward. His pulse roared in his ears. No, not like this, not now. And then Frank moved. It happened in a flash, a blur of motion in Jack's periphery, a hand lunging forward, fingers wrapping around the back of his coat. A powerful yank. A second later, another set of hands joined in. Jack barely registered it before he was pulled backward, crashing onto the frozen ground. A violent crack split through the silence, the ice beneath his feet giving way into the abyss. But Jack was no longer standing on it. He was safe. He gasped. His body convulsing from the cold, Bailey still clutched to his chest. When he looked up, Frank was there, his broad chest rising and falling with exertion, his face tight with something that wasn't quite anger, but wasn't regret either. Behind him, Sheriff Mike Harris was breathing heavily, his arms still half outstretched from helping pull Jack back. The silence between them stretched, thick and loaded with too many things unsaid. The three men, two former enemies and an old friend, stood in the heart of the storm, the icy wind cutting at their faces. Jack looked down at Bailey. The pup was completely still, his golden fur matted with ice, his breathing shallow. But he was alive. Jack's chest ached with relief so fierce it nearly knocked the wind out of him. Frank took a step back, shaking his head. It wasn't supposed to go this far. Jack met his gaze, seeing something in Frank's expression that he hadn't seen before. Doubt. Conflict. A realization too late. The man who had hated him enough to steal Bailey and leave him to die had just saved both of them. Frank exhaled, running a gloved hand over his face. His dark hair was damp with sweat and melted snow, his features sharp and hollow beneath the shadows of the storm. He had always been a strong man, tall, broad-shouldered, but now he just looked tired. "I think," he started, then hesitated, his lips parted, as if he was about to say something else, but then he just let out a breath and muttered, "I went too far." Jack didn't speak. He didn't have to. The truth was already written in Frank's face. The sirens in the distance grew louder. Red and blue lights cut through the darkness, bouncing off the trees and casting eerie shadows against the frozen ground. The rescue team was arriving. Frank turned toward the flashing lights, his expression unreadable. He didn't run. He didn't fight. He just stood there. Sheriff Mike Harris pulled his handcuffs free from his belt. His voice was quiet, almost reluctant. "You know what happens next." Frank let out a sharp breath through his nose, then slowly lifted his wrists. He didn't resist. He didn't argue. He just accepted it. Mike clicked the cuffs around his wrists, securing them with practiced ease. Frank lowered his head slightly, a shadow passing over his expression. He wasn't the same man who had smirked at Jack hours ago, reveling in his suffering. He wasn't the man who had once seethed with rage in a jail cell, plotting his revenge. That man was gone. Jack pushed himself up, his legs shaking, still clutching Bailey tightly. He watched as Frank, his old enemy, his old ghost, stood there in the snow, hands cuffed, shoulders squared, finally defeated. But there was something else in his posture, too. Relief. Jack swallowed hard, not knowing what to say, not knowing if there was anything left to say. The emergency team rushed in, their voices blending into the storm. Elena Carter was the first to reach them. The veterinarian's breath formed quick puffs of steam in the cold air as she took one look at Bailey and snatched him from Jack's arms. Eleanor had always been the kind of person who moved with precision and confidence, never wasting a second. Tall and lean, her sharp brown eyes missed nothing, and her firm hands knew exactly what they were doing. She had seen her share of injured animals. She had saved dozens in her lifetime, but even she looked worried as she pressed a hand against Bailey's small chest. Jack's throat tightened. "Is he—" "He's alive," Elena cut in quickly, her voice clipped with urgency. "But he's in bad shape, hypothermic, barely holding on. We need to get him warm, now." Jack let out a breath that was almost a sob. He nodded. Eleanor turned sharply, barking orders to the rescue team as she carried Bailey toward the ambulance. Jack took a step to follow, but then he paused. He looked back at Frank. The man who had once wanted to destroy him had saved Bailey, had in the final moment made a choice that even he hadn't expected to make. Frank met his gaze. He didn't smirk, didn't glare. He just nodded. Jack hesitated for only a second, then returned the nod. And then, without another word, he turned and followed Elena into the night. The fluorescent lights of Pinewood Veterinary Clinic cast a sterile glow over the small, warmly furnished recovery room. The faint hum of medical equipment mixed with the soft breathing of a small golden retriever curled beneath a thick woolen blanket. Bailey was alive. His tiny chest rose and fell in steady rhythm, his body still weak but fighting, just as he always had. Jack sat beside the recovery table, his calloused fingers hovering just inches from Bailey's fur, afraid to touch, afraid to break the fragile peace that had settled over them. His body ached, his joints stiff from the past 2 days of exhaustion, but none of that mattered. Bailey was coming back to him. A quiet knock on the door broke the silence. Eleanor Carter, the town's veterinarian, stepped inside, her dark brown eyes sharp yet kind. She was still dressed in her medical scrubs, a navy blue jacket thrown over her shoulders. Her caramel-colored hair, usually tied neatly in a ponytail, had loosened from the stress of the night before. "He's stable," she said, her voice professional but soft. "His temperature is back to normal, and he's responding well to fluids. He'll be weak for a few days, but he's a fighter." She offered a small smile, just like his owner. Jack exhaled slowly, his tension easing for the first time in what felt like years. He gave a small nod but didn't take his eyes off Bailey. "Thank you," he murmured. Elena pulled up a chair across from him. "You should get some rest, Jack. It's been a long night." Jack shook his head. "Not until he wakes up." As if on cue, Bailey stirred. The small pup let out a soft whimper, his head shifting slightly against the blanket. Then, slowly, his tired brown eyes fluttered open, searching and landing on Jack. Jack felt something inside him crack wide open. Bailey blinked groggily, then, with effort, lifted his tiny head and nudged his nose against Jack's outstretched hand. The simple gesture, gentle, trusting, warm, hit Jack harder than any words ever could. Jack swallowed hard. "Hey, buddy," he whispered, his throat tight. "You scared me half to death." Bailey let out a weak, contented sigh and nestled his head against Jack's palm. A silent thank you. A silent, "I'm still here." Elena smiled softly at the exchange. "He knew you'd come for him." Jack didn't answer, just ran a rough hand over Bailey's damp fur. Margaret would have loved this dog. The courtroom was silent. Rows of wooden benches stretched beneath tall windows that let in weak winter sunlight. At the front, the judge's bench stood high and imposing, a symbol of justice in a town that rarely saw cases like this. The air smelled of old paper and polished oak, the quiet murmur of voices barely cutting through the stillness. Jack sat in the gallery, his fingers curled around the edge of his seat, his eyes locked on the man standing in the defendant's chair. Frank Dawson, the man who had taken Bailey, the man who had left him to die, the man who had nearly let Jack drown in that frozen swamp, but also the man who had saved him. Frank stood rigid, his once defiant posture now replaced by something quieter, heavier. He had always been a strong man, broad-shouldered, his presence imposing, but now he looked diminished. His face was drawn, dark circles beneath his hollow eyes. The scruff on his chin had grown uneven, his usual sharp glare replaced by something less certain. He didn't fight. He didn't argue. He just stood there. The judge, Eleanor Graves, was a woman in her 60s with sharp, knowing eyes and a stern mouth. She had presided over Pinewood's courtroom for nearly 20 years, known for her fair but firm hand in dealing with both justice and mercy. Her silver hair was neatly pinned back, her robes pressed without a single crease. She had seen criminals before, had sentenced men who felt no remorse. Frank was not like them. "The court finds the defendant guilty," she said, her voice measured and clear, "for the charges of animal cruelty, endangerment, and reckless endangerment of human life. Frank Dawson is sentenced to 7 years in prison." A hush fell over the courtroom. Jack didn't move. He didn't celebrate. He didn't feel satisfaction. Frank let out a slow breath, his shoulders lowering slightly. Then, for the first time, he turned his head and met Jack's gaze. And for the first time, there was no hatred, no malice, no rage, just acceptance. Jack studied him, searching for something, anything that could explain the shift in Frank's eyes. And then he saw it. Relief. Frank gave the smallest of nods, a silent acknowledgement, a silent, "I'm done fighting." Jack held his gaze, then ever so slightly nodded back. The bailiff moved forward to take Frank into custody, but he didn't resist, didn't speak. He just bowed his head and let himself be led away. Jack exhaled, the tension in his chest finally loosening. The past was done. The pain, the hatred, the revenge, it ended here. The town of Pinewood was never the same after that. Bailey's story spread faster than Jack expected. It was talked about in grocery stores, at the gas station, at the small diner where Sarah Whitmore, a tall, no-nonsense woman with sharp blue eyes and a dry wit, ran her business. She had always been the town's heart, keeping everyone fed and never tolerating nonsense. But even she had softened when she heard what happened. "I'll tell you something, Jack," she had said, the day he brought Bailey in for breakfast. "I never thought I'd live to see the day you'd have a shadow again." She had given Bailey a warm biscuit, ruffling his fur with a rare, gentle touch. "Guess I was wrong." And then there were the kids. A local teacher started using Bailey's story in her classroom. A lesson on kindness, on second chances, on the importance of compassion. Jack had never been one for attention, but when she invited him to speak to the students, he didn't refuse. He told them about Bailey, about how a single act of cruelty could change a life, but so could a single act of love. And as he watched their eyes light up with curiosity and empathy, he realized this wasn't just about Bailey anymore. It was about what came next. The first snowfall of the season blanketed Pinewood in fresh white, soft and clean, like a fresh start. Jack stood on his porch, hands in the pockets of his coat, watching as Bailey ran through the yard, his golden fur a stark contrast against the snow. The pup was stronger now, his body healed, his spirit unbroken. He bounded toward Jack, ears flopping, his tail wagging furiously. Jack knelt down, rubbing a hand over Bailey's head. The pup pushed against him, pressing his small weight into Jack's chest. Jack chuckled. Yeah, I missed you too, kid." Bailey licked his face, then curled up beside him, content. Jack looked out at the town, at the people who had once felt so far away, but now seemed a little closer. He thought about Frank, about forgiveness, about the choices that led him here. He let out a breath, his lips curving into a rare, small smile. Margaret had always said everything happened for a reason. Maybe she was right.